This is To the Right House, a new podcast series by the Global Campus of Human Rights. From skepticism to hope, from utopia to empathy, we discuss human rights, riding waves, but also signaling where the light is. This podcast was recorded in Venice, Italy, on the island of Lido, at the Global Campus headquarters.
Welcome to the Global Campus podcast, To the Right House. My name is Graham Finley, and I have the pleasure to host the second series entitled Hope-Based Human Rights. With this second series, we want to move away from crisis narratives or human rights discourses focused on denouncing wrongs, and instead try and argue that discourses based on hope, empathy, and solidarity are more effective frames to talk about human rights. To do so, we have invited 5 experts who will discuss a different theme each week, from the need to stress positive human rights achievements to the power of telling a human story. We will start today with an introduction on the importance of positive human rights and a key question: to hope or not to hope. For this, it is my honor to welcome George Ulrich, Academic Director at the Global Campus of Human Rights and previous host of our first podcast series. Thanks for being with us, George.
Thank you, Graham, very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, to enjoy and to join you in this challenging and interesting topic.
So hope is an emotion and fear is an emotion, and they're powerful emotions. Is it true that we are driven more by emotions than by rational thought?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, Graham, if it's one or the other. I would actually like to rephrase the question slightly, and maybe it's going more on the emotional side. I'm not quite sure. But to rephrase the question and ask, are we driven more by a sort of inherent sense of injustice and a need to correct wrongs in the past, a visceral reaction to wrongdoing, to suffering, to social injustice, even infused with anger and a sense of need for change? Or is our action driven more by a positive vision for the future? You might call that hope. You might call it aspirations. It's a sense of wanting to forge a just and functional and enabling society. Which of the two, if those are emotional, then the question to me is, which of the two emotions is stronger? Or is it rather a sense of complementarity and interplay between both? And I'm probably inclined to go down the latter road, but let's see where our reflections take us.
Yeah, I mean, again, this isn't just for us in our own enjoyment of our rights or our lives or living our lives. It's also about communicating to other people. So how do you think we could promote this hope-based, this positive vision of human rights in our communications with others, or trying to get them to engage in a particular spirit with human rights?
Yeah, I think I have 2 thoughts in this regard offhand, Graham. And as I said, I'll anticipate that I want to also go back to the sense of indignation and anger and injustice, and as part of the package as well. But to stay with the affirmative message, as you're phrasing it, I think first of all, it's very important to recognize that human rights aren't just relevant the moment they are violated or abused. That we maybe tend to focus on them when there's a sense that they're in jeopardy. But in fact, human rights are part and parcel of the entire fabric of the societies we inhabit. We take for granted that we won't be arbitrarily imprisoned. We take for granted that we have a certain freedom of movement, freedom of expression, right to make essential determinations about our own family life, what have you. We assume all of those rights, and the fact that we don't think about them very often is simply a measure of how successfully and how well they have been integrated in our societies. And the point is that we need, as human rights advocates, to make that visible, to counter the narrative that human rights are only really relevant for marginalized people on the outskirts of society or in jeopardy, in trouble with the law. No, human rights are in fact relevant to all of us, and they are enabling us exactly to be productive, successful, harmonious members of society. And that message, I think, is an affirmative message, and it's one that we as human rights advocates need to articulate more clearly and more strongly. So there, I'm totally in line with you in the podcast series.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about it's not just about us as individuals who might want the individual things we have human rights too, but we live in a society where a lot of these can only be jointly realized.
Yes, and we take, and as I just said, we take many of those simply for granted without thinking about it. We take the by and large effective rule of law for granted. We take a large degree of equal treatment and equal opportunity for granted. And when there are questions about that, we start to think about human rights. But in fact, it's the human rights that guarantee those premises in the first place. You know, the way in which human rights have over decades, if not centuries, been integrated into the fabric of our constitutional democracies. You know, so that's the point one. Point two, which I think is also, to me at least, from coming at all of this also to a large degree from a philosophical point of view, is I think, what are human rights about? What do human rights safeguard or protect? And very often we think about this in terms of safeguarding and protecting our human bodily physical integrity, so the prohibition against torture, for example, or arbitrary imprisonment, or even arbitrary execution, and so on. That's a way of safeguarding our existential and personal integrity, or it's about safeguarding certain freedoms, whether it's freedom of family life or freedom of movement, freedom of expression, what have you. But I think there's also a fundamental positive aspect, not just prohibiting or avoiding abuse, but enabling us to be agents in our own lives. You know, and there's a certain school of a philosophical school of human rights called the capabilities theory, which is actually looking at human rights as something that expands capabilities, that expands our agency on many different in many different areas of our lives, and conversely sees abuse and poverty as a reduction of capabilities. You know, poverty is not just a matter of not having money to buy your next meal or to have to secure a shelter and so on. Poverty is a lack of access. Poverty is a lack of opportunity and so on. And expanding access, expanding opportunities, expanding capabilities is at the core of what the human rights agenda is all about. This is something that, for example, Martha Nussbaum articulated with reference to a feminist approach to human rights, expanding capabilities for all human beings, but for women in particular. Amartya Sen did this with regard to impoverished people in the global south, and talking about how development is an agenda of expanding capabilities. With regard to the agenda of human rights for people living with disabilities, which is one of the relatively new and very important human rights agendas of the 21st century, that's very much, again, about expanding capabilities, about organizing society in a way that facilitates agency for people coming at social life from different points of view, different backgrounds, and with a historical legacy of limitations and inhibitions. You know, so I think this is a very important way to look at what human rights are all about, and it again helps to articulate an affirmative, what you might want to call a hope-based message. You know,
and it's concrete. I like that very much. And then, you know, crucially, capabilities are important things that we want to either do or to be. You know, states of existence. But it also involves the choice not to pursue a particular good in a particular way, right? And I think, so when we think about human rights, we know that they're inalienable, but that doesn't mean that we can force people's human rights on them. I mean, do you see the capability approach and this capability way of thinking about human rights as a way for us to pursue our own path and you know, enjoy our human rights in the ways which we would particularly want, and especially maybe in a diverse society or a diverse world where we might have different priorities and different ways of conceiving what enjoying the right to freedom of religion might be, for example?
Yeah, I think, Graham, this is a big discussion, is sort of steering us in a slightly different direction, but it's an interesting discussion. Sometimes people have said they look at human rights, the sort of moral self-assurance of human rights advocates, and they say, yeah, they're just a sort of new generation of priests preaching an affirmative gospel. I don't think so, and I think the main reason that's not the case is exactly that human rights doesn't prescribe, doesn't tell us how we should live. It says something about parameters of coexistence, how we live together in society, but it's always premised on the fundamental idea that we are authors of our own destinies, and there's space for us to adopt different choices about what we perceive as the good life, different choices, even with regard to our perceptions of right and wrong in many regards, as long as they don't interfere with and inhibit the abilities of others to do the same. So the human rights normative framework isn't an objective, substantive morality. It's actually it's a more limited set of norms that exactly should enable us to fill in, to flesh out how we envisage each of us in different ways a good life, and to live together to the extent possible peacefully on that count.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not accusing you of thinking this, but some people have seen this diversity of approaches to human rights or diverse views about the good life or how to live together in society, and have advocated a minimalist approach to human rights, where you sort of pare it back down to a relatively limited set of human rights, maybe especially focusing on civil and political rights, but also a sort of minimal aspiration in terms of just, and again, this is maybe the more negative side, just combating the worst kinds of violations. What do you think about that approach?
Well, I think yes and no. And that's the yes and no is going to be part of my answer to many of the questions we confront today, Graham, I think. So I think there's something to be said for the minimalist approach. I think it's very important that we don't overreach as human rights advocates. It's very important we leave space for different competing political visions, for different cultural and traditional normative frameworks, and so on. And I think the human rights agenda should be kept, in a certain sense, relatively lean. But that doesn't mean just to focus on prohibitions against torture and the right to life, or freedom of expression, maybe the sort of classical few human rights that are very widely affirmed and accepted. I think it's equally important to say there are minimum core standards with regard to economic and social rights, for example, whether it be right to education, right to health, right to participate in public and social life, which are all, I think, exactly expressions of expanding agency, what we were talking about before. So I think you can adopt a quasi-minimalist approach across the whole human rights spectrum, and not just in a selective way. So that would be the kind of direction I would want to go in this.
So I want to go back to the sort of dual emotions we were talking about earlier, and you were saying as complementary to human rights action and thinking of our lives in terms of human rights. And I want to link it maybe to us living in a society, because a lot of the social movements which predated and have now post-dated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are predicated on maybe both those emotions, or do you see it that way?
Yes, Graham, I do very much. And I think we are, in much of our action, we're inspired by a sense of wanting to correct perceived and experienced wrongs. I was actually reminded of a quote by Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher Walter Benjamin, his thesis on the philosophy of history, where he says somewhere that our action is nourished more by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than of liberated grandchildren. And I think there is something to that, but yet Benjamin is very much reviving or projecting a sense of messianic hope for the future. And so it's the interplay between visceral reactions to wrongs in the past and the sense of charting a hope-based path for the future. That's a very interesting connection to me.
Yeah. Do you think, in especially maybe social media terms and in social media dialogues, we spend too much time focusing on the wrongs of the past and not enough on sort of solutions which we can find in the present?
As I said before, I think there is something about articulating and emphasizing the affirmative message and not just focusing on perceived wrongs, partly because they render the human rights agenda, relatively irrelevant to large cross sections of at least societies in the global north. But I would like to maybe reflect for a moment on, again, the question of philosophical questions. Inherently, what are human rights? Where do they come from? And I don't subscribe to philosophers that say human rights are, God-given, self-evident, based on dictates of pure reason or something along those lines. I think human rights are products of human struggle. As Christoph Heinz, the South African eminent human rights expert, said in his struggle theory of human rights, he said, every human right is the flip side of the coin of a fighting cause. And to put that differently, human rights have emerged in history as minimal normative standards that people have had to fight for in opposition to the powers that be, and that eventually have reached a point of widespread acceptance. So, for example, the prohibition against slavery, that was not taken for granted. It was fought for and eventually emerged as a dominant norm in particular countries and societies, and eventually as a dominant global norm, and it became a standard of international law. Many of the economic and social rights were fought for by labor movements, for example, who were demanding decent conditions of work. Rights to gender equality, women's rights, were fought for by women's movements at great sacrifice and great pain, and eventually became rights that have been integrated into our legal architecture and social fabric. And I think that's the main point here is that rights have always emerged out of a sense of processing historical experience. They have emerged from a perception of indignation and reactions to wrongs in the past. The sense of crimes against humanity is exactly the idea, is that this is something that certain actions are so atrocious and so unacceptable that we have to establish a norm that says never again. We cannot allow such abuses and such wrongdoings to repeat themselves or to persist. And by doing that, by invoking the pledge, we denounce the wrongs in the past. We will not allow them to continue in the future. Nunca más, never again. By doing that, we're exactly in the same moment affirming a commitment and allegiance to an alternative normative structure, an alternative normative framework, which is a forward-looking framework committed to respect for human dignity, committed to exactly what we were talking about before, the agenda of expanding human agency and removing societal abuses, abuse of power. So I think they're intrinsically linked. The reflection on wrongs in the past and the affirmation of a commitment to a forward-looking, human rights-based positive agenda. It's not one or the other. It's not an either or. Right? This is what's so important, to see how the two mutually presuppose each other. Exactly because human rights are grounded and embedded in history. And they become universal, they become global, because history is becoming a universal global history in the modern era, and in particular in the last few centuries. Increasing global interdependency posits a need for a strengthened common framework of international law.
No, I think that's a really rich history compared to what is often described as the origin of human rights in, again, as you say, never again, the terrible crimes of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And yet, as you say, also a world to be made new as a reaction, a positive, hope-based reaction for that. But I like the fact that you brought all those other causes and other histories into it, and then invoke the idea that history itself is becoming global, because we're seeing, and I know you've written about this extensively, we're seeing a whole bunch of new actors, new nations in many cases, new groups, new transnational organizations who are developing their own approaches to human rights, which are rooted in very, very different histories and possibly in very, very different traditions. Do you think that is easily accommodated within our contemporary understanding of human rights, or the system which we developed in response, maybe specifically to the crimes of the Second World War?
Thanks, Graham, for raising this question. I think it's a very important question. I think the first answer is no. I don't think easily accommodated. I don't think anything is easily accommodated, especially in the kind of divisive, contentious political environment that characterizes the early 21st century. But I think it's a very important challenge. It's something that is essential for us to rise to and react to in a constructive way.
And I think we can distinguish between people who are just don't think that human rights are the way or the lens to view our lives or our events, and people who sort of recognize the gaps or certain ways of thinking about human rights and try to make them better. I know a lot of disabled people are critical of some of the ways in which the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is framed, including the name of the convention, right? Yeah. I mean, do you find that these criticisms leave room for both creative, but maybe also these more positive, hope-based visions of human rights for actual people who experience marginalization or some kind of structural injustice?
I'm not sure, Graham. I think I don't really want to speak on behalf of advocates of a particular group. You could look at indigenous peoples around the world, whose causes now have become salient, partly because of the intersections with climate justice agendas and so on, And I think what's very important is that representatives of groups that in various ways have been marginalized, suppressed, excluded, I mean, they will speak for themselves. And I think this is what is important, is to create space for their voices, also in the way in which the normative framework continues to evolve. And I think we are at junctures where there is a radical need for new departures and for new developments of the normative framework. And that's very much in I think, consistent with the underlying affirmative vision that you started the podcast with. I have one other thought that I didn't get to yet that I would like to introduce, Graham, if I may.
Absolutely.
It's and I don't know if that's now more on the side of expressing a reservation or more on the side of agreeing with the premise of the podcast as you elaborated in the beginning. But what I wanted to say, what I've been thinking, was that as you shift from a focus on particular wrongs, on violations, on injustices, and so on, which as we have said, are also a very important incentive to action. But as you shift from that to a more future-oriented, positive, affirmative vision of what a society that is inclusive, that is enabling of people from different walks of life and in different social positions, that is more just than so the sort of positive vision of a human rights-based just social order. As you make that shift, I think to a certain extent you also shift from a more individualistic perspective to a more collective perspective. And I noticed that in your questions and also in things I've seen written about this, it's very typical that the word "we" comes to feature very strongly. What can we do? How can we create a more just society? How can we defend and prosper from a hope-based vision of human rights? There's this collective development, and what I think that, whereas you could say victims of violation are in some ways or other particular, they're specific, they're individual, either single human beings or collectives, but nevertheless specific groups. and what I think what we see here is a shift also from the more law maybe based focus on denouncing injustices to the collective political agenda of reshaping society. And I think what we see here is the sort of infusion of the human rights agenda with politics, in a certain sense, with political vision and with competing political visions. So I think that the hope-based human rights agenda, in a certain sense, and you may correct me, but I have a feeling in a certain sense, the hope-based human rights agenda also marks a repoliticization of human rights. We inherited a kind of legacy that told us that the human rights normative framework is politically neutral. It should be possible to embrace no matter where you find yourself from left to right on the political spectrum, as long as you're not on the far extremes. And if you're on the far extremes, what is defined as a far extreme is in part simply not accepting the common allegiance to minimum standards of fundamental rights. So that's a kind of, and that could be a right-wing or a left-wing extreme, but everybody in between should agree on the same fundamental human rights principles, which are then incorporated into our constitutional legal orders and so on. What I'm saying is that now that you put the topic of a hope-based, affirmative approach to human rights on the agenda, I think you also invite, at least you open the door for a more explicit connection, linkage of the human rights agenda with various kinds of political agendas, and you can articulate this in different ways. You can say that by affirming human rights, you also advocate for a certain degree of substantive social equality, for example, which requires some level of redistribution, which is then perceived as a kind of political agenda, for example, or in other regards. But you could also see it the other way around. You could say there are certain kinds of political action, for example, a reshaping of the neoliberalistic global economic order and international trade and so on, that needs to be somewhat reframed in order to even make it possible to realize human rights in many parts of the world, and in particular in relation to marginalized and deprived individuals and communities. That you need some form of radical or at least substantial political change in order to, in fact, work effectively with agreed international human rights standards. So I think there's a two-way kind of linkage between politics and international human rights law that we have kind of been shy to engage with, and I think that your podcast series on hope-based human rights, in a certain sense, compels us to engage with those connections. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And what I'm partly taking away from this is not any politics is necessarily going to be a human rights-based politics, but or even a politics of hope. Because not all political forms of politics, not all political movements, not all political persuasions are, in fact, a politics of hope.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I think this is what you're sort of implying, is that the flip side of this, the sort of ugly, whatever counterpart, is the way in which politics in the current era is very much about, accentuating and mobilizing senses of resentment. The way in which I interpret, or people interpret, their dissatisfaction in life as a consequence of established privileges, established elite interests, and so on. And so the reaction to this widening inequality in society and discrepancy, and even to a certain extent, the reaction to the lack of enjoyment of effective human rights protection, is being used as a kind of argument against the advocates of an expanded liberal law-based order that is guaranteeing human rights. So there is a kind of evil twin, so to say, or flip side that we have to be on guard against. In advocating an affirmative human rights message. And that's, again, an area where we as human rights defenders are not necessarily that successful. We're somehow playing into the narratives of our detractors in ways that we don't fully understand or master. And I think that's sort of cause for concern.
No, I think that really reveals your own hopeful vision, if I can say, for human rights, in that I think about when you talk about a politics of resentment, it's the kind of opposite of what you're advocating, which is human rights as a way of processing all these terrible things which have happened and continue to happen, unfortunately, processing in the psychological sense, making sense of it, trying to move on in a healthy way. Right. Whereas the politics of resentment, you're not processing it. You're just continuously grabbing onto it and sort of hurting yourself over and over again.
There is this very famous Freudian dictum, that whatever is not remembered is repeated, right? That if you don't, and remembrance is not just a matter of cognitively being aware of, once again, something that happened in the past. It's actually about processing and remembering and integrating into our sense of where we are and who we are and so on. We recollect a historical legacy and incorporate it, make it part of our own, but exactly as a way of freeing ourselves from certain compulsive patterns in the past, certain abusive patterns in the past, and in doing that, exactly affirming a vision of a different future and hopefully a better future. So that's the kind of that is the process. That's the process that is kind of lies at the heart of what we call transitional justice. But I think, in a certain sense, we're in transition on a global scale all the time. We are processing historical legacies, not just after a civil war, but in fact on a continuous basis as a international community inhabiting a frail planet.
Well, thank you very much. Just one last question. Is there any area of human rights that you think is especially hopeful or that gives you hope?
I think what gives me hope is the area of human rights education. I have to say that being privileged to work for the Global Campus of Human Rights, being privileged to interact with students in the European program, we have students from 30 different countries. One third of the students are from outside of Europe, but all of Europe also being represented. And then having the opportunity to visit our sister programs in other regions of the world. Very recently, I was in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, where we're in the process of starting up a Central Asia master program. The students are brilliant. The students are motivated. The students are driven by an affirmative vision of change, both by the will to correct current and existing wrongs and by the will to forge a better future. This is something that's youth-driven, and I'm sort of humbled and in awe of their resources and initiative, and that for sure gives me hope.
Well, thank you, George, for sharing your vision of hope and your views with us, and for preparing our audience for what is next to come in this series. So stay tuned.
My pleasure, and thanks for organizing this. Thanks for inviting me.